KrisAnne is an attorney and a former prosecutor, and she was fired after teaching the Constitution to Tea Party groups. She would not sacrifice liberty for a paycheck. She is a disabled veteran of the U.S. Army, a Russian linguist, a mother, a pastor's wife, and a patriot. She now travels the country and teaches the Constitution and history that gave us our founding documents. Born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, she received her undergraduate degree in biochemistry from Blackburn College in 1991 and her Juris Doctorate from the University of Florida, Levin College of Law, and is a former Russian linguist for the U.S. Army. KrisAnne worked for several years as a state prosecutor and 2 years with a prominent law firm defending religious liberty for First Amendment rights. KrisAnne now resides in North Florida with her husband Chris, a pastor and former foreign language instructor for the U.S. Navy, and her adopted son Colton. Please welcome this evening KrisAnne Hall.
So I want to thank everybody for their patience, and I want to thank you guys for coming out and wanting to know more about your country and about the Constitution itself. If we don't know what we need to know about the Constitution, how many of you are planning on turning 18 one day? Right? That means at some point in time you are going to be voting. At some point in time, you may run for office. At some point in time, you may take a job where you have to raise your hand and take an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. That oath is a promise. A promise to the people who have elected you, who have entrusted you for the singular purpose of our Constitution. The singular purpose of our Constitution, as indicated by the preamble, everything that it does, our framers were focused on one thing: preserving the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. That was the whole reason that we ever fought for our independence from Great Britain. It's the whole reason that we chose a constitutional republic. It is the whole reason that we have a constitution at all, so that we could preserve the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. And so, if you're going to take that oath, if you're going to vote for someone who will take that oath, how do you keep that promise if you don't know what the Constitution is? If you don't know how it's supposed to work, and you don't know how government is supposed to work? You see, we're taught a whole lot of things these days that simply aren't so. We are taught things that lead us to believe that our independence was just some random act by a bunch of rogue guys who didn't want to pay their taxes. We are taught that the Constitution was an invention of our framers, that they all got together and pooled whatever knowledge they had and made up everything that's in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. Simply not true. There is not one single original thing in our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, or our Bill of Rights. Because you see, it wasn't written in 1787. It took 700 years to write our Constitution. There are 5 documents that were written over those 700 years. Our framers called them Liberty Charters. I call them the genealogy of our Constitution. How many of you know what a genealogy is? Somebody just shout out, what's a genealogy?
Family tree.
It's like a family tree, right. Okay, I forgot to lay down the rules. Grown-ups, you have to stay quiet. So all the young people look at the grown-ups and go, shh, come on, you know you want to. They do it to you all the time. Let's do it. Ready? Going, shh. The only people allowed to answer are my students. And I'm here for you guys tonight. And so a genealogy is like your family tree. Now let me ask you something. If someone went back in time and killed my great-great-grandfather, would I be here? Not really. But if somebody went back in time and eliminated one of these 5 documents, we would not have a Declaration of Independence, a Constitution, or a Bill of Rights. This is what's important. Knowing where we came from, so we know what we have, so we can understand how it's supposed to work, so that we can make it work right. So what we're going to do today is we're going to learn the history of our Constitution, so that when it's time for you to take control of America, you can undo all the bad stuff we've left behind for you. How do you feel? What do you feel about that? You happy about picking up after all our mistakes, huh? Well, I'm sorry. We have, my generation and the generations before me for decades have been doing it all wrong. But I'm hoping that we can start doing it right, so it's not so bad for you guys. So I want to start off by asking you guys a question. A little pop quiz. My students who have been in my genealogy class are not allowed to answer. And as a matter of fact, even though I want you to answer out loud throughout this lesson today, this is the single time where I want you to keep the answer to yourself. Don't answer out loud. Don't mumble the answer. Don't even lip sync the answer. You see, if you're going to defend the Constitution with your vote, with your oath, with your life, your fortune, and your sacred honor, you have to know what it is. And what I want you to do, and I'd like for the adults to participate in this as well, because we're not saying anything out loud. There are 5 liberties that are identified in the First Amendment alone. I want you to yourself, in your own head, to name all 5 liberties in the First Amendment. We have a Supreme Court justice in Florida who took a poll of the people in Florida and asked this question. Found out that only 2% of the people polled could name all 5. Now, I don't know where you guys fall in that statistic, and you have plenty of time to learn, although we should have been teaching you this already. But I want to ask you this question. If you don't know what your rights are, how do you know they're not already gone? First off, in understanding the Constitution, I want to let you all know that there is not a single person in this room with constitutional rights. We say that all the time, but nobody here has constitutional rights. There's no one in this country with constitutional rights. Why? Because the Constitution doesn't grant you rights. Your rights are yours whether there's a Constitution or not. Your rights are yours by the nature of your creation. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. No man, no government gives you rights. And so you don't have constitutional rights, you have inherent rights. You don't have constitutionally protected rights. The Constitution cannot protect your rights. It's a piece of paper with ink on it. Let me ask you guys a question. Can the Constitution go sit in your representative's office and demand that they comply? Can the Constitution pick up a pen and write your senator a letter? Come on, guys, let's practice. Ready? No. Thomas Jefferson said that the tree of liberty had to be fertilized with the blood of patriots and tyrants every 20 years. Now, we need to thank God that's not been the history that we've repeated, but what happens if it is? Can the Constitution pick up a sword or a musket or something to defend you? No. Because the truth of the matter is, the only one who can protect your rights is sitting in your seat. And if you don't know what they are, you're probably not exercising them, which means they're already gone. What good is freedom of speech if you never say anything controversial? Do you know how the easiest way to start practicing exercising your rights? You stand up in public every single day and say something out loud that's controversial. The First Amendment is not there to protect you to say politically correct speech. It's not there to protect your ability to say things that make people happy. It's there to protect you when you say things that people disagree with and you challenge them down to their very core in what they believe. Benjamin Franklin wrote letters in the papers under a fake name by the name of Silence Do Good. And in 1722, Franklin said that without freedom of thought, there can be no wisdom, but without freedom of speech, there can be no liberty at all. And so if we are going to know how our government's supposed to work, and we're going to know how to be good, liberty-minded people, we have to know where the Constitution comes from. And our history of our Constitution is what's important. This man is James Madison. How many of you guys know James Madison? Well, I'm hoping you don't know him. You've heard of him though, right? Okay. James Madison is called what?
The father of the Constitution.
The father of the Constitution. And he has written an essay called Property in 1792. And this is very, very important for us to understand. He said, in a word, as a man is said to have a right to his property, he may be equally said to have a property in his rights. Your rights are just as physical as the house that you live in. Would you allow someone to come and steal your house? Madison's saying your rights are exactly the same as your house. Why would you let someone come and steal your rights? The origin of our American liberty, as John Adams would say in a dissertation on feudal and canon law in 1765, he said, liberty must at all hazards be supported. We have a right to it derived from our Maker. How many of you have heard of a principle called natural law? How many of you have heard of a guy named John Locke? How many of you have read the complete treatise of John Locke? See, everybody's sort of looking around and giggling under their breath to find the big nerd that's read all the treatise of Locke, right? Do you know what's interesting? That's okay, I'm a nerd with you, man. There's two of us in the room. The interesting thing is, if I had asked that question in 1765, the reaction would have been very similar. Except the people would have been giggling and looking around for those who had not read Locke. Locke, Montesquieu, Algernon, Hobbes, all of these people are the ones that our framers studied as young people growing up to understand liberty and how government is supposed to work. Natural law is a principle that John Locke takes upon to teach us, and Locke says that liberty comes from God. Because we are created in the image of God, we have inherited certain things from God. One thing that we've inherited from God is freedom. God is the most free being in the universe. Raise your hand if it's your job to wake up every day and tell God how to run things. Usually the husbands then turn and look at their wives, right? You think that's what we do. We tell you what to do all day. We must be telling God too, right? No, we don't even tell God how to run things. But you see, because we are created in the image of God, we've inherited that freedom. Not the power and not the wisdom, but the freedom. But we don't want to live in a place where people are free. I'm not being sarcastic, I'm being realistic. Because you see, if we live in a place where people are free, that means I'm free to lie, I'm free to steal, and I'm free to murder. I am free to do whatever I want to do, regardless of how that hurts you. Does that sound like a nice place to live? Oh, come on, guys. You guys want to live there? No. We're going to practice something, okay? My husband's a pastor. So after me, everybody's going to shout amen. Ready? Amen.
Amen.
One more time. Amen. Amen. All right. I'm just making sure you guys have voices. Don't be shy. So if we live in a place where people are free, then I can do anything that I want to hurt you because it's all right by me. Liberty and freedom are not the same thing. Because liberty is freedom plus morality. That shared morality that says, yes, I recognize I am created free, I can lie, I can steal, and I can murder, but I will not, because it's wrong. Now, John Adams also says, even if we didn't get this gift from God, he said, our fathers have earned and bought it for us at the expense of their ease, their estates, their pleasure, and their blood. John Adams is saying, hey, don't look at me, I didn't invent liberty. It was given to me by my fathers. So let's talk about John Adams' fathers. We need to lay some groundwork real quick here. When you think about the Revolutionary War and who fought in the Revolutionary War, sometimes we're tempted to say it was a war between the Americans and the British. Anybody ever heard that? Okay, that's not true. Because you see, at the time, there were no Americans. They were British people fighting their British government for independence. They were called Americans only in the sense that they were part of the American colony of the British government. And so everybody who lived in the American colonies, in the British government, were governed by British law. That's why our Constitution, its history, is British legal history. Now, in 1014, the AngloSaxons were the people that lived on the land that we now call England, which is why it's called England, because it was first called Angloland. And the Anglo-Saxons were living quite peacefully, quite prosperously, with just small communities. They had no king at this time, and they were doing very well, except for one thing. You see, the outside kingdoms, all the kingdoms around them were looking in and saying, hey, those Anglo-Saxons are doing pretty well for themselves. But you know what? They don't have a king. They must need one. So the Anglo-Saxons kept getting attacked by outside kings. But because they lived in small communities, and the communities were so far apart, they didn't have text messaging, cell phones, and instant messaging on Facebook, right? So they were having a really hard time organizing each other for their common defense. And not only that, to keep a kingdom from attacking you, you have to be able to negotiate treaties with a foreign kingdom. How many of you think that a king is going to be willing to negotiate with just any common person? Not going to happen. So the Anglo-Saxons go to Ethelred, and they say to Ethelred, because his family had been kings when the Anglo-Saxons had Anglo-Saxon kings, they said to Ethelred, we will make you our king on one condition. Your only job is to negotiate with foreign kingdoms. Your only job is to keep us at peace, or to organize us in war, and to perhaps even organize with these foreign kingdoms so that we can engage in foreign commerce. You will leave us alone to govern ourselves. Now, if we'd been teaching the Constitution properly for generations, right now, everybody in this room would be going, oh, I see. Because that's the exact same agreement that the states made when they created our federal government. The agreement the states made was, we will create this federal government with one purpose: foreign affairs. And they will leave the states alone to govern themselves. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, says in Federalist Papers 45, the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. We created a box for the federal government, few and defined. He said those that remain in the states are numerous and indefinite. He says the powers delegated to the federal government by the Constitution are to be exercised on external objects. External objects, that's the way the founders talked about foreign affairs. Now, James Madison isn't going to wait for the Supreme Court to define those terms, foreign affairs, because James Madison doesn't think the Supreme Court has the authority to do that. So he's just going to go ahead and tell us. Those external objects, he says, are war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. That's all our federal government was ever delegated power to do. Foreign affairs and things like war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. Because Madison then says, every other power, down to the minute lives, prosperities, and properties of the people, are reserved to the states. And they didn't make that up. They got that from their history in 1014. How many of you heard of a guy named Solomon? Solomon said, there is nothing new under the sun. Human nature never changes. And the interesting thing is, when you start calling somebody a king, don't be surprised when he starts acting like one. And when people start looking to government to be their provider, don't be surprised when they start acting like subjects. So all we have to do is fast forward just about 30 years. We have a brand new king. His name is Edward the Confessor, and the people are describing Edward as a generous king. Now let me ask you a question. Do you think under the original Ethelred agreement that the king had the power to give things to the people? No. But we've already slipped out of our limit and defined box because people like free stuff.
Yeah.
You like free stuff? Yeah. And so now they think it's great. They're going to give Edward the power to give them stuff that obviously he's taking from other people first because they like Edward. But you know what the problem is? Sometimes when you give power to government, when you like the people in government, we forget that they don't get to stay forever. Is Edward going to be king forever? No. So what happens if we get a wicked, evil king next? He's going to have the same power as Edward. And that's exactly what's going to happen, because you see, Edward is about to die, and he has no son to take the throne for him. So the AngloSaxons try to find a king. Now, it's real easy, actually, because they always have a list of people who are next in line to be king, cousins. And the next in line to be king is a guy named William the First. The problem is, the people, the Anglo-Saxons, do not want William the First to be king. Because William the First is not Anglo-Saxon. William the First is from Normandy. And they don't want to have a foreign leader for their kingdom. Why wouldn't they want a foreign leader?
Because he wouldn't care for them as much.
He wouldn't care for them? What comes with a foreign leader?
Foreign laws.
Foreign laws. Foreign rule. What happens if Norman kings don't act like Anglo-Saxon kings? As a matter of fact, the Anglo-Saxon kings are very unique. Because you see, they have formed what we call a limited monarchy. It's a monarchy like a kingdom, but the king is limited in his power by the people. And William the First, being a Norman king, lives in your stereotypical kingdom where the king has all the power. And if the king has all the power and he's handing out the privileges to the people as he sees fit, what can he do? Take them back, right? Who tells the king what to do? Nobody. And so when you live in a kingdom with an unlimited king, you wake up every single day wondering what's right and what's wrong. Because what was okay yesterday may be wrong today because the king woke up in a bad mood. So they hatch out a plan to appoint a guy named Harold as king. Harold has been Edward's right-hand man. They're pretty sure Harold's going to be generous and good, just like Edward was. But you see, this year, 1066, we're not appointing kings. Kings are not elected. Kings are born. It's a principle called divine right. Divine right says God makes kings. And the only way you get to be king is if you're born in the right family and in the right birth order. So if you're the fourth born son of 4 sons, you don't get to be king unless you can kill off 3 brothers. How many of you know that happened? Right? Well, William catches wind that the Anglo-Saxons are trying to steal his rightful throne, and he gets really mad, which is bad news for the Anglo-Saxons. See that sword? William has a nickname. He's called William the Conqueror. What do you suppose happens when you make a guy like that mad? What's he going to do? He's going to conquer, right? He raises up his Norman army. He goes over and defeats Harold and the English people and makes himself king. How many of you heard of the Battle of Hastings? That's what this is about. 1066. Now William is up for the surprise because now he's king over a limited monarchy, and he does not want to be limited in his power. Now all kings have a power called the power of decree, which means they issue decree. It's like writing laws. Decrees bind the people to the king's laws. And William could step up and say, I'm king now. We're not going to be an Anglo-Saxon limited monarchy. We're going to operate like I want to operate because I'm king, and we're going to be Norman kings, and we're going to have unlimited power. But let me ask you a question. Do you think the people are going to like this?
No.
If you don't like your king, do you start a recall petition to remove him from the throne? Do you find a new king to run against him in the next kingly election? No. When you don't like your king, what do you have to do? Kill him, right? You form a rebellion and you chop off his head. William happens to be pretty fond of his head. So he knows he's not going to step up and issue a decree to take these, to change the government all at once. Instead, he figures out it will be better if I can slowly change the government in such a way that the people don't even notice. You see, the king is limited by common law. So the first thing the king is going to do is start replacing the judges in the common law system with judges who are not loyal to the common law, but loyal to the way the king wants things to go. He starts using those judges to take his foreign law and apply it on the people, even when it's contrary to their common law. He starts using this law and this sword to chase landowners off of their land, sometimes chasing them completely out of the kingdom. Now, something very interesting happens when you live in a kingdom. When land is abandoned with no ownership, the ownership of that land goes back to the king. Is this land abandoned? No. These people have been forced off their land. But William looks out and says, oh, look at all this land that's just been mysteriously abandoned. It all belongs to me now. And he starts inviting all his foreign friends to come live in the kingdom. How else do you keep foreign law in a kingdom unless it's full of people who like that foreign law better than the king? Because otherwise, the people are going to do what? Chop off his head. In this day and age, the churches are very, very powerful. And William starts changing out the leadership in the churches with men who are not loyal to the word of God, but loyal to the king. So now the king can use the churches to force the people to do things even when it's against the word of God. Now this fundamental transformation takes place over about 40 years through the reign of William I and his son, William II. He's actually called William the Red. Can anybody guess why?
Because he has red hair.
That's right, he has red hair. And William II is described as being a king just like his father, wicked and evil. And you'll notice that William II is only going to rule for about 13 years, which is sort of good news for the people, right? Because he's a bad king. But you see, one day, William II and his little brother, Henry I, go hunting together. Can you see how this story is going to end? William II is killed in a mysterious hunting accident when a stray arrow from Henry's hunting party mysteriously accidentally kills his brother, coincidentally making him king. How many of you think this was an accident? Well, guess what? Human nature never changes. And the Anglo-Saxon people were not buying this accident story either. Now, even though they didn't like William II, murdering your brother to become king does not make you a popular king. Because if you'll murder your brother, then what are the people to you? Right? So Henry has to do some things to make the people happy. Now, one of the things Henry does is he comes to the people and he says, look, I understand the circumstances surrounding my brother's death seem a bit suspicious. So I want to put your mind at ease, and this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to find 3 men. We're going to call them a grand tribunal. They're going to investigate whether I'm at fault for the death of my brother or not. How do you think that's going to work out when the government's investigating itself? Guess what? Henry's not at fault for the death of his brother, but the people aren't believing this either. So Henry does a few more things, but the most important thing that Henry's going to do, remember I told you 700 years to write the Constitution, 5 documents. Henry signs the first document in the history of our Constitution. It's called the 1100 Charter of Liberties. In this 1100 Charter of Liberties, Henry promises that government will never be evil and oppressive ever again. That didn't last very long, did it? Henry makes promises that identifies what an evil and oppressive government is. He says, if any baron or earl of mine shall die. Now, the barons and the earls are the property owners. And remember, the people had a big problem with the way Henry's dad and his brother were stealing property from him. So he's going to make sure that they know he's not like that. And he says, if any of the property owners should die, their heirs shall not be forced to purchase their inheritance, but shall retrieve it through force of law and custom. Henry is simply saying that when the heirs of property have to buy that property from the government before they can receive it, that's an evil and oppressive government. How many of you young people have heard of inheritance tax? Ask your mom and dad about inheritance tax. Because in 1100, Henry called inheritance tax evil and oppressive, and we call it revenue. Henry also promised that if any of my barons should commit a crime, now the barons were lawmakers and law keepers. And he said, if any of my barons should commit a crime, he shall not bind himself in the crown like the time of my father and brother, but shall stand for the crime as the law demands and make the amends that are appropriate. Henry was just trying to teach us that if the men who make and enforce the laws consider themselves above the law, you have an evil and oppressive government. How many of you think Henry's interested in liberty? He was interested in keeping his head.
Yeah.
But you know what? Now the people have a promise in writing, signed and sealed by the king, that binds every single king forever in the future. And they're going to need that promise because in 100 years, the Anglo-Saxons are going to have the most evil and oppressive king they'll ever know. John. John is a massive taxation king. And if you can't pay your taxes, you can't even afford to pay your taxes in John's kingdom, which is probable given the level of taxation, John is going to arrest you, throw you into prison. He's cutting off hands, feet, ears, tongues of people because they can't pay their taxes. He's even killing them. They called him ruthless and vicious. I read one historical document that said, even hell was fouled by the presence of John. That makes him a pretty bad dude, right? You guys know John. You probably don't realize it. How many of you heard of a guy named Robin Hood? That's the king in the Robin Hood stories. Why? What are we taught about Robin Hood? Why is he famous? What did he do? Go ahead, shout it out. Yeah, that's exactly what we're taught. We are taught that Robin Hood robbed from the rich to give to the poor, but that's not true. Robin Hood was not robbing from the rich to give to the poor in an effort to redistribute wealth. Robin Hood was taking from the king and the crown the money that had been stolen from the people through oppressive and unlawful taxation and returning it to the people. What is John going to do if you can't pay your taxes? It's going to kill you. Robin Hood's not trying to give everybody the same amount of money. He's giving people their lives back. He's not a socialist. He's a liberty fighter. Because the first step to liberty is always a right to life. How many of you have seen the Disney version of Robin Hood? What's Robin Hood? He's a fox. John is what? A lion. Who's John's best friend? A snake. Now watch. This is your homework. You got to go back and watch the movie again now that you know the truth. Because Disney gets it better than your school books these days. You'll see John, the lion, standing over bags of money going, taxes, taxes, glorious taxes. He'll say, bleed them dry with beautiful taxes. You'll see Robin Hood always taking from the king and the crown and returning that money to the people. So seconds later, the sheriff of Nottingham, who's a big old bear, comes in and takes that money from the people, calling it what? Taxes. Now, John's going to do a lot of bad stuff. And the people get enough of him. The final thing that sets everybody off is the Anglo-Saxons have picked a man named Stephen Langton to be the head of their church. John steps up and says, I don't like this guy. I'm going to choose who's going to be the head of your church. But you see, John has already forgotten about the 1100 Charter of Liberties. Because the very first promise Henry made in the 1100 Charter of Liberties, it didn't even make it to the list of 14, it was in the preamble. He declared that the church would be completely free from government intrusion. That, by the way, is the proper definition of separation of church and state. Thomas Jefferson did not invent separation of church and state in 1802 when he wrote the letter to the Danbury Baptists. He was remembering his history lesson when a king in 1100 said, if the government is in your church, it's an evil and oppressive government. Separation of church and state has always meant the government has no business in your church. It has never meant that God has no business in your public conversation. So a rebellion comes against John, and we get the second document in the genealogy of our Constitution. This one's called what? The Magna Carta. How many of you know we are now, should be, celebrating a very special time? Anybody know? June 15th was what? The 800th birthday of the Magna Carta. And if we start talking about the 800th birthday of the Magna Carta, maybe we'll be able to start talking about why the Constitution is so important. Because you see, without the Magna Carta, there'd have been no Constitution. There'd have been no Declaration of Independence. There'd have been no Bill of Rights. Now, the Magna Carta is an amazing document. Who remembers the name of the person who wrote the 1100 Charter of Liberties? Henry I. He was what? The king. The 1100 Charter of Liberties was written by the king. The Magna Carta is not written by the king. The Magna Carta is written by the people. The Magna Carta is the people standing up to the king and saying, hey, you made a promise to us that you would never be evil and oppressive again. You obviously have no idea how to keep that promise. So now we, the people, are going to stand and make ourselves more powerful than the king, and we're going to tell the king what he can and cannot do so he can keep his promises. Magna Carta creates a committee of 25 men called the Royal Council who have the power to sit in the king's court and tell him, nope, sorry, can't do that. breaks your promise. Our 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Amendments in our Bill of Rights comes from clauses 38 through 40 in the Magna Carta. Clause 61 of the Magna Carta carries the last clause to our First Amendment, the right of the people to petition the government for a redress of your grievances. We didn't invent any of that. We inherited it. Now, John is going to sign the Magna Carta because he has a sword at his throat. And people are going to chase him off the throne less than a year later. How many of you think that kings being told what to do by people is going to go over well with kings? Not going to go over well. So for the next 400 years, the people are going to have to fight with kings to maintain this Magna Carta. So we're going to fast forward. The year is now 1625. The king's name is Charles I. He's a young, handsome guy, and he loves to party. As a matter of fact, I read one historical document said that Charles loves to romp about Europe, spending on his every whim and fancy. Whose money is he spending? The people's money. How is he collecting their money? Taxes. Well, in 1625, the Royal Council is now called Parliament. How many of you guys have heard of Parliament? Parliament gets sick and tired of Charles' wasteful spending, stands up to Charles and says, hey, we're not passing any more of your laws until you get your spending under control. Can you imagine that? Parliament said to the king, we're going to defund all your activity until you get a proper budget. Charles says, okay, fine. But I want to remind you something, Parliament. I'm king. Why do I even need a parliament? And he dismisses Parliament. Now, does he have to have the sergeant at arms to come and remove from them the court? What if he just stood up and said, where Parliament refuses to legislate, I'm just going to go ahead and regulate? What if he held a State of the Kingdom address and said, if Parliament will not pass laws, I will. After all, I have a quill and a messenger. If he stands up and declares Parliament powerless, then they are if they act like it, right? Well, Charles has learned from John and the previous kings that if you break too many promises too quickly, the people will put a sword at your throat. So he's just broken the promise of the Magna Carta by getting rid of Parliament. But he wants to keep collecting their money. And he can't pass a tax, because there's no taxation without Parliament, and that would just be too many violations at once. So he comes to the people and he says, my people, I'm going to be issuing a decree. And in this decree, I'm going to be collecting your money. But don't worry, it's not a tax. I'm calling it a forced loan. Anybody think there's a difference between a tax and a forced loan? Nope. 5 knights stand up to Charles and say, you know what? This violates our Constitution, which means it is no law at all. So we're not going to collect your tax, we are not going to enforce your tax, and we're not even going to pay it, because we don't have to comply with things that are not laws at all. Charles throws them in prison, denies them their day in court. Remember, we didn't invent that. That came from the Magna Carta. But a rebellion forms against Charles, giving us the third document, the Petition of Right of 1628. The Petition of Right says, it doesn't matter what you call it, there'll be no taxation without representation. And yes, due process is our right, not something that the government can give and take away based on their convenience. But while we have the sword at the king's throat, we're going to take more power from the king and secure more liberty for the people. You cannot invoke martial law on us unless we're being invaded by a foreign nation. You cannot quarter soldiers in our homes. We didn't invent the Third Amendment. We got that from the Petition of Right. Not only that, the Petition of Right in the preamble declares that liberty is the inherent possession of men and not the gift of government. Charles is going to sign the Petition of Right the same way John did. How was that? With a sword at his throat. But now the people are going to let Charles stay king. Maybe they thought he learned his lesson. Anybody think Charles is going to change his ways? No. He goes back to business as usual. And 20 years later, we have a brand new rebellion against Charles. Charles is charged with treason, found guilty, and sentenced to death. The process gives us the fourth document in the history of our Constitution. This one's called the Grand Remonstrance of 1641. The Grand Remonstrance of 1641 is an amazing document. It says, "The root of all this mischief we find to be a malignant and pernicious design, subverting the fundamental laws and liberties of our kingdom." So what does that mean in English? What they're simply saying is, we've been watching kings for 600 years now, and we're noticing a pattern. They're doing the same things over and over and over again. Remember what William I did? What was the first thing William I did? Corrupted the court system, right? With the judges and the infiltration of foreign law. Then what did William do? Took the property rights from the people. He took over control of the church. Created fiat money so that the government could control the monetary system. And he disarmed the people while the government remained armed. And in 1641, they called that treason. Now let me ask you a question, since I've used a word that maybe you don't know what that means. How many of you know what fiat is? Oh, a good bit of you. So for those of you who don't know what fiat is, somebody give me a piece of paper. I should have my little props ready, right? You got one? Oh, bring it up, pass it up here. What is the difference between this piece of paper and the dollar bill that you have in your pocket?
That has value.
This has more value than the dollar bill that you have in your pocket. Yeah, that's funny. The only difference is the dollar bill in your pocket has numbers on it that the government has assigned a value to. Is there any difference in the value of the paper between a $1 bill and a $100 bill? No. The only difference is the number of zeros on the paper. Fiat money is money that has no value by itself. It's a value that the government assigns to it. Let me show you how this works. Something really funny happened in 1965 with our money. In 1965, we stopped making coins, quarters and dimes, out of silver. In 1964, our dimes and our quarters were 99.9999999% silver. Now, there's no silver. So here's a little tip. Watch your quarters and dimes. If they say 1964 or before, keep them because they're silver. Now, what difference does that make? In 1964, you could buy a gallon of gas for 17 cents. How many would you like to buy a gallon of gas for 17 cents? What can I tell you? You already do. You see, that 1964 quarter, if you have one today, that 1964 dime, if you have that one today, is worth about $2.58. Just that dime, because it's silver. So if you take a 1964 dime and trade it in for its real value, and then add a few more change, you have a gallon of gas. Because the price of gas has not changed. The value of your dollar has. Because you can't make more gold, but you can print all the paper you want. And the more paper you print, the less your money has in value. That's why fiat is evil and oppressive. Now, 40 years later, we have a brand new king. His name is James II. Same old plan, same old design. But the funny thing is these kings are learning from their mistakes, right? We can be just as tyrannical, just as oppressive as we want, as long as we make sure we can give people things to distract them from what we're taking from them. And James must be about to do something really, really big, because he stands up before the people and he says, I'm going to give you something you've never had before. I'm going to issue a decree called the Declaration of Indulgence. And in this Declaration of Indulgence, I'm going to give you religious liberty. You no longer have to be a member of the Church of England. You can have church anywhere you want, with any pastor you want, preach anything you want, anytime you want. And the government will not prosecute you or persecute you. On one condition. Before you have church, you must tell the king where you'll be meeting, when you'll be meeting, who will be preaching, what will be said. And you must promise that you will never, ever, ever say anything bad about the king in church. Does that sound like religious liberty? No. Ask your parents about a 501c3. 7 bishops stand up to James and say, you know what, James? We have a promise over 500 years old that says the church is completely free from your intrusion. We're not following your law because it violates our Constitution, which makes it no law at all. James throws them in prison. Now, he's learned from Charles, you have to give them their day in court or the people will chop off your head. So, James makes sure these bishops have their day in court, but then he doesn't have anything to be scared of because he's charged these bishops with a crime called seditious libel. Seditious libel is that part you can't say bad things about the king. But the law is written in a way that even if you're telling the truth, you have to die. The 7 bishops got their day in court. 2 of them were found not guilty because they had judges who refused to enforce an unconstitutional decree. The other 5 were also found not guilty because they had a jury of their peers who refused to find them guilty of an unconstitutional law. See, we didn't invent our right to trial by jury of our peers, and we didn't invent the essential check and balance of jury nullification. We inherited those things. A rebellion comes against James, bringing us the 5th document. This one's called the English Bill of Rights of 1689. The English Bill of Rights of 1689 says, whereas the late King James II, by the assistance of evil judges, counselors, and ministers employed by him, did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the laws and liberties of our kingdom. Who here knows what extirpate means? I did not know. I had to look it up. It means to completely destroy. If you completely destroy something, is there anything left? No. They said what James was doing was completely destroying liberty. They made a whole list of things that James was doing. You can actually go online and read the English Bill of Rights, and you will see this grievance. By assuming and exercising a power of dispensing with and suspending of laws and the execution of laws without the consent of Parliament. They said when the king was writing law, overturning law, and setting aside law, when that is a power reserved to Parliament alone, that's the complete destruction of liberty. How many of you heard of a principle called separation of powers? I'm sure you're going to learn more about it this week. Separation of powers was not invented by our framers. They had separation of powers in their government. They had an executive branch in the king, a legislative branch in Parliament, and a judicial branch. Separation of power says power cannot be shared and it cannot be stolen. And they said when the executive branch is writing laws, overturning laws, and setting aside laws, when that is a power reserved to the legislative branch, the only result is the complete destruction of liberty. So how many of you have heard of a thing called executive orders? That is exactly what this is. Executive orders have been in operation by our presidents for decades, writing law, overturning law, and setting aside law, when that is a power reserved to our legislative branch alone. The interesting thing is, in 1689, that was cause for rebellion. Now, what are we doing about it?
Watching TV.
Enter in George III. How many of you heard George III? George III was not inventing tyranny on our founders. He was engaging in the malignant and pernicious design as identified in 1641. So let me let you in on a very important little bit of information. How many of you heard of the Boston Tea Party? The Boston Tea Party was not about taxes. It was about a whole lot more than that. As a matter of fact, by the time the Boston Tea Party had come around, the tax on tea had been cut in more than in half, and many of the taxes had been repealed. You see, here's what happened. George III wanted to recoup a debt that the colonists had, that Great Britain had created by defending the colonists in the French and Indian War. And he said to the colonists, we are going to collect this debt by imposing a consumption tax. Who knows what a consumption tax is? Just shout it out. Anybody? I heard it. It's a sales tax. Consumption tax is just like a sales tax. You don't pay it unless you buy it. And they had a consumption tax placed on linen, lumber, sugar, tea, paper, and ink. The stuff that the colonists had to have. And then they got a brilliant idea. We can maximize our revenue from these consumption taxes by forcing the colonists to buy the things we've taxed. And if they refuse to buy the things we've taxed, we'll throw them into prison, send them to Quebec to be tried. Now they had to get into the colonists' homes to figure out whether they were actually purchasing the stuff they needed to purchase. So the Parliament gave the tax collectors and the customs agents the power to search and seize in the colonists' homes without warrants. Our Fourth Amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects from unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. We didn't invent that. We inherited it. So our colonists are saying, hey, these laws that you keep passing on us are being done without our representation in Parliament. You're denying us our right as Englishmen to elect a representative and send it over there. Parliament said, oh, don't be ridiculous. Of course you have representation in Parliament. We have people in Parliament who have volunteered to represent your interests. You think that's going to work out for them? The colonists said, wait a minute, if they're over there on the island creating laws to be enforced over here on our continent, and they never have to come over here and live under the laws that they make, they don't represent us. They represent themselves. You see, if the people who make the laws do not have to follow them, that's not representative government. So the Boston Tea Party was not about taxes. It was about legislation without representation. It was about mandated purchases, warrantless searches, denial of due process, and foreign courts and foreign law. So the Boston Tea Party, they threw the East India Trading Company tea into the harbor. Not by accident, but on purpose. Because it was the East India Trading Company tea that was the government-mandated tea. And by the way, just to dispel a little rumor I keep floating around these days, the Sons of Liberty were not looting, okay? As a matter of fact, John Hancock and several of the colonists paid back the East India Trading Company for all the tea they lost. It was not about robbing, it was not about stealing, it was not about destroying property. It was about making a statement, a petition to their government for a redress of their grievances. So why did they leave this kingdom? They were all members of a kingdom. How many of you remember from your history lesson that shortly after our independence from Great Britain the first time, people were begging George Washington to be king? There were people who said, okay, now we're free from Great Britain, let's just go ahead and make our own kingdom. Wow. We're a little thick in the head, don't you think? Good news is there were some people that said, hey, we've been doing this now for quite some time, so let's not do the same thing again and expect some different results, because that's really just insane. Because you see, they figured out that kings only keep their promises as long as you hold a sword at their throat. And the minute you put down the sword, they go back to being kings and people go back to being subjects. So let's talk about this. They said, no. We want to preserve the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Kingdoms don't do that. Why? Because a kingdom holds all the rights and the power, hands out the power and the rights and the privileges to the people. And if he's handing them out, what can he do? Take them back. They said, no, we can't have this kingdom. We have to have a republic. A constitutional republic specifically, and a constitutional republic is the exact opposite of a kingdom. A constitutional republic is where the people hold all the rights and delegate power to the government as they see fit. How many of you heard or have read of the Declaration of Independence? Thomas Jefferson said, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. But when any government operates contrary to those means, it is the right, he'll say it's the duty of the people to alter or abolish them. Why? Because when the people hold all the rights and we delegate power to the government the way we want, what do we have the power to do? Take it back. Because in a republic, the people are the kings and government is the subjects. Now, I know you've heard this. How many of you have heard our government referred to as a democracy? Okay, we are not a democracy. But if we knew what a democracy was, we wouldn't simply shake our head and roll our eyes at teachers teaching us that we're a democracy, or politicians calling us a democracy, or our favorite conservative speakers calling us a democracy. Because you see, a kingdom, if we're going to we'll build a little political spectrum. Kingdom's all the way over here, right? Republic's complete opposite, all the way over here. Where does the democracy fit? It's not here. It's not here. As a matter of fact, there's no difference between a democracy and a kingdom. The only difference between a democracy and a kingdom is how many people rule over you. A democracy is mob rule. A democracy is where the majority holds all the power and hands out the rights to the minority as they see fit. And if the majority holds the power, hands out the rights, what can they do? Take them back. So in a democracy, if you are a member of the minority community, you have nothing unless the majority says it's okay. You see, our framers knew democracies do not preserve liberty. The only thing that democracies preserve is that there will always be rulers and always be slaves. Problem is, there's a principle. If you repeat a lie long enough, it becomes the truth. We keep calling ourselves a democracy, we might just become one. Do you know how you know we're not a democracy? How many of you have heard of the civil rights movement? How many of you have heard of a lady named Rosa Parks? If we had been a democracy, Rosa Parks would still be in the back of the bus. Because in a democracy, minority groups never have a society-changing voice. Only in a republic can minorities change society through equal representation. But if we keep calling ourselves a democracy, we'll become one. And that might be okay with you, as long as you're always on the right side of the mob. But the minute you're in the minority, you're nothing but a slave. and there's no way to get out. Liberty. Liberty must at all hazards be supported. We have a right to it derived from our Maker because we are created in the image of God. Liberty is freedom plus morality. Because you know what? Laws don't stop crimes. Laws aren't even designed to stop crimes. Laws are designed to identify a legal standard by the society and set up a mechanism to punish people who break the laws. Because there's only one thing that will stop people from doing bad things, and that's their heart. If we don't know where we've come from, if we don't know what this means, if we don't know how much it took to get it, we might be apt to believe that the Constitution is a living, breathing document that can mean whatever we want it to mean, however we want it to mean it. We can believe that we're a democracy and bring ourselves into our own servitude. And we can destroy the constitutional republic created to give us our liberty. Or secure our liberty, rather. Liberty comes from God, not from government. So they can't take it away. This is how you get in touch with me. This is my logo. This is my website, KrisAnneHall.com. I am on Facebook. I am on Twitter. I have a radio show that I do 6 days a week. You can catch the archives on my website if it's not locally broadcasted here. If you have a local station that you think would like to carry my show, it's only an hour a day, and I will send them a fully formatted show. All they have to do is plug their commercials in however they want to, and I do it totally free. So it won't cost them a dime, and there's no excuses. How many of you can think of at least 3 people who should have been sitting with you right now? Well, guess what? This is what I do. I teach over 265 classes in over 20 states every single year. I teach high school, middle school students. I teach college students. I teach adult groups. I teach state legislators, and I teach sheriff's offices. As a matter of fact, my law enforcement course has been approved in the state of Texas for 4 continuing credit hours of education. And I'm supposed to be coming back here, so far, in February of next year to teach your legislators their constitutional duty as state legislators. So what I want to mention to you is that if you have a school that needs this lesson, or you have a church, I have a religious liberty lesson that I teach in churches that uses the Bible to show our responsibility to God and to liberty. I have classes on the Second Amendment. I have classes on the Fourth Amendment. I have classes on the Ninth and 10th Amendments. I have classes on the sovereignty of the states and our solutions to those problems. Anybody here hear the sovereignty class that I gave last night? Did you come away with some real practical solutions? That's what this is all about. Because you see, we're not a kingdom. And if we don't like our government, we don't have to chop off heads. We have a better solution, peaceful solutions. And I teach without any speaking fees. I don't require any group to pay for my travel, my food, or my hotels. We operate entirely by faith. On my website, you'll find out that I've written 5 books. There's a book called Essential Stories for Junior Patriots that teaches exactly what I just taught you and has lessons about founders and framers that you don't get to read about anywhere else. How many of you, or anybody here, know the name of the first guy to die in our liberty movement? And you're not allowed to say. I taught him yesterday. Anybody know? Adults? Who said that? Oh, you can't say that. Shh. He's a black man by the name of Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks was a freed slave who had become a whaler for the merchant marines. His ship was docked at the Boston port, and he heard an alarm go off. He ran up deck to put out the fire, because that's usually what an alarm means on a ship, only to find out that his own government was picking arms against his own people. Crispus Attucks ran back below deck, got 55 of his shipmates, came out, and gave his life for us. It was March 5th, 1770, the Boston Massacre. There was a poem written about Crispus Attucks in his day by a man named John Boyle O'Reilly. I usually read it out of my book, but I sold all my books, so I'm going to try and remember it. Honor to Crispus Attucks, who was leader and voice that day, the first to defy and the first to die, with maverick, car, and gray. Call it riot or revolution, his hand first clenched at the crown. His feet were the first in perilous place to pull the king's flag down. His breast was the first one rent apart, that liberty's stream might flow. For our freedom now and forever, his head was first laid low. Call it riot or revolution, or mob or crowd as you may. Such deaths have been seed of nations. Such lives shall be honored for aye. Who knows what that means to honor something for aye? Forever. They thought in Crispus Attucks' day that we would celebrate and remember him forever. How was the first time you've ever heard of Crispus Attucks? Did you know there were battalions of freed slaves who fought for our independence and our liberty? There were provisions within the states that said, if you're a slave and you want to fight for independence and liberty, you are now a free man forever. But I think if we really, really thought about that, we would be ashamed of ourselves. Because you know what that means? That means there are some men who gave their only free breath so that we could have liberty. And we don't even know their names. It's so important to know where we've come from. It's so important to know who we are. Because we owe it to these people to make sure that we have what they gave us and we're able to pass it on to you. And one day, that's going to be your responsibility. So, invite me back to teach your groups. It won't cost you a dime. Unless you want to help us out. Because we do rely on donations and the sale of the books and those kind of things. So you can go to my website and you can buy the books. You can go to the website and make donations. I am not a 501c3 because I do not allow the government to tell me what I can and cannot say. So if you help me out of faith, not out of government benefit. I also have with me in my bag business cards that have my website, my mailing address, my logo, those kinds of things on there. And anybody who wants a business card to remind them to go to my website and buy my books, you can have a business card. I also have DVDs, training DVDs. I have a specific DVD that teaches this lesson, a lesson that I taught live to a Christian school in New Mexico. And you can get that on the website too. So what I'd like to do is know, did you learn anything today? So I want to know, do you have any questions? I don't usually do question and answer sessions, so this is a little special for me. Let me see if the kids have questions first. Come on now, I don't want you to be shy. Anything about the Constitution, anything about the law? Let me give you a little clue. Anybody here want to go to law school? Let me tell you something. They don't teach the Constitution in law school. You now know more about the Constitution than probably all of the Supreme Court justices of the United States, okay? They teach law, in law school they teach constitutional law. And that teaches the lawyers and the future judges that they know more about the Constitution than the men who wrote it. And then they'd spend the rest of the time teaching us how to work around the Constitution to win our arguments. It wasn't until I started studying on my own that I really understood what the Constitution really meant. And so, who's got a question? Are you a student?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. You look older in the dark back there. I was ignoring you. Okay, go ahead.
So what were the 5 liberties mentioned in the first article?
Oh, the First Amendment. You ready? Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, the freedom to peaceably assemble, and the right to petition the government for a redress of your grievances. You know the last one? That's the one everybody always misses. You know how you remember that? The right to petition the government for a redress of your grievances is the right to complain and expect to have your complaints answered. That's what that means. You don't have a right to complain at home, by the way. You don't have a constitutional republic at home. Your home is a benevolent dictatorship. At least it's a hope it's a benevolent one, okay? All right, what's your question back there? Yes, sir.
With everything that I've tried to study, I've found very little written on the fact that when we actually speak of the liberty movement, it's common to speak of a constitutional republic, and I think it's just because of the fact that it's a matter of how much we've read. And it's just our understanding of collectively what we've read. There's very little, to my understanding, actually written to actually state clearly that we are a constitutional republic. So I don't really know how to ask the question. I guess, if somebody was to debate against you on what form of government we have, whether we have a democratic republic or whether we have one of these things, where's the best source of information that can clearly define somebody that we're explaining this to, that we are actually created as a constitutional republic because of those?
Okay, well, we are a republic.
Yeah, we are.
And the republic is created through the Constitution, which is why it's a constitutional republic. Now, you might hear the framers call us a democratic republic. But what you need to understand is that word democratic means something different to them than it does to us. What they're talking about is the demos and the kratos, okay? If you want to know what the framers said, you need to use a dictionary written in their day. Modern day dictionaries use modern day definitions, and words change over the years. Democracy, or let's put it this way, not a democracy like we talk about it today, but a democratic republic is the use of the word in its original form, meaning a demos and a kratos, okay? The demos is power, kratos is people. So a democratic republic is where the power comes from the people. But the constitutional republic is different from a democracy because even though the power originates with the people, we have chosen to create laws and government through representation. And that's the distinction. Democracies don't work through representation, they work through popular vote, through mob rule. Okay? But a republic, a constitutional republic, works through representation. So you have to understand the origin, the demos and the kratos, and that gets a little bit thick sometimes. Yes?
And can I just help out answering this question? But if you really want to know how the framers felt about it and what they thought they were creating, I would read Madison's notes of the Constitution.
Oh yeah, well, I think that was a given because he had talked about reading what they had written. So obviously you need to read the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers. You need to read Madison's notes on the convention. You need to read the letters that they wrote to each other during this period of time. And I will say all the way up to about 1820. Because even still, they were trying to understand how this was supposed to work. How many of you remember from your history lesson that our first attempt at independence from Great Britain wasn't as successful as we wanted it to be? After our first war for independence from Great Britain never recognized our independence and kept operating as if we were part of their kingdom, which is why we had to have the War of 1812. And our framers call the War of 1812 our second war for independence from Great Britain. So this whole period of time, they're still discussing on how this works and what they meant for it to be. Any other questions? Yes.
Obama thinks he's the first black president. Who was John Hanson?
You want to tell us?
He was the first appointed president of the United States before the Constitution.
See, that's something that people don't realize, is that we had presidents before George Washington. We had a constitution before our current constitution. It was called the Articles of Confederation. Now, what happened was we created the Articles of Confederation to create our union at first. But they created through the Articles of Confederation a central government so small it couldn't work. And as it did its job, when it could do its job, it did it all wrong. Because their guidelines were not as clear as they needed to be. And so after this was not working, the Continental Congress got together again. They dissolved the Articles of Confederation, which got rid of the federal government. So for a period of time, we had no central government, legally speaking. And that's why they created the Constitution, and that's why the Constitution is called the more perfect union. I forget, do you remember how many presidents we had under the Articles of Confederation? Were there 7? 7? Yeah, I can remember. So there you have it. Yes, sir.
So, since you didn't get the opportunity last time, I'm taking it down.
Oh, you mean yesterday?
Yesterday, yeah. So
Am I going to have to teach the whole lesson to answer the question?
I don't think so.
Okay.
When you were talking about nullification,
Uh-huh.
the states just said, no, that's unconstitutional.
Uh-huh.
Is there any way within that to repeal the 16th and 17th Amendments? And I don't think Congress is going to do it, and I don't trust an Article 5 convention.
Okay. You know, in order for everybody in this room to understand, I have to teach that whole lesson yesterday, and that was about, I don't know, it was like an hour and 20 minutes. Basically your question is, can the rightful remedy of nullification by the states get rid of the 16th and the 17th Amendments? The answer is no. Because they're part of the Constitution now, unfortunately. Through our ignorance, we transmuted ourselves. How many of you know what the 17th Amendment is? Anybody? It is the popular election of senators. In 1913, under the leadership of Teddy Roosevelt, who was the leader of the Progressives of 1912, they lied to us about the way our senators were being appointed and said that we have to have a general election for our senators. Now, prior to the 17th Amendment, our senators were appointed by the state legislators. And not only that, they didn't serve terms of office. They were called at-will employees of the states, which means they could be hired and fired the moment they didn't do their job right. So there was no recall petition, there was no elections, no special elections. The states, through their people, simply said, hey, you're not doing the job of representing our state the way you need to, you're fired, we're going to send somebody else up there to do that. Now the interesting thing is, when you read why the framers made the senators appointed in that way, you want to smack your hand on your forehead and think, how stupid could we possibly be by changing that? You see, the whole purpose for making the senators appointed by the states was to make sure that the people were always watching Washington, D.C., to make sure the states were always watching Washington, D.C., that the senators were always worried about keeping their jobs and keeping the people happy, and to keep special interest groups and lobbyists from taking over Washington, D.C. And the minute we put them on popular election, the senators forgot they represent the states, and the special interest groups and lobbyists moved in. Okay, you already asked a question. Give somebody else a chance.
The state of Idaho has had some real consternation over nullification. We have an attorney general who doesn't believe in nullification.
Oh, so he's a federal supremacist. Okay.
And Liberty Academy, because they have paper.
Tom Woods. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Just mention that, please.
Yes, no, Tom Woods is awesome. I like Tom Woods. I have never had the opportunity to personally meet Tom Woods. I've been involved in a sort of email conference with him, but I've never actually met him. Don't tell him I've never read his books. But you see, I'm an original text historian. And I think as a writer of books of history and a teacher of history, it's important for me to not rely on somebody else's interpretation or compilation of history. So everything that I teach and all the books that I write are based on the fact that I have read all the documents and based on the history that I have read and that I have learned. Because I don't want somebody else's opinion to creep into my writings, because then that's not history anymore. And so, but Tom Woods is a great, he can explain nullification better than I did to you guys last night. Well, I didn't have time. I didn't teach nullification. I taught, the state's sovereignty and the solution of nullification. But you guys are in for a treat. I'm really sad. I have to fly to Delaware, so I'm not going to be here. But is he coming to teach about nullification? What's he teaching about?
Go ahead.
Yes, he will be speaking on nullification as a method of enforcing the Constitution on Friday night.
That is fantastic. That is absolutely fantastic. My book, Sovereign Duty, which is the book that I have written to teach the framers' plan on getting the federal government back under control, has a chapter on nullification. If you are interested in knowing something about Article 5 Convention, I have a chapter on Article 5 Convention in my book as well. I have a rather distinguishing perspective on Article 5 and nullification, which puts me at odds with both sides. So I try to bring forth the truth, which means we have to learn some things that we don't like to learn, that are sometimes not making us happy. And so also on my website, if you're interested in Article 5 conventions, I took a whole week to talk about Article 5 convention on my radio show. So there's a whole week, 5 hours, where I talked about Article 5. And then there's a shorter article that I wrote called Nullification or Article 5, an Adult Conversation, because I got so tired of the backbiting and the bickering between the two crowds. And I also have a little 2-part primer on nullification as well that's easy to print out and hand out. Yes, sir?
I think the liberals' greatest weapon is the distracted patriot. There are so many issues that this week it's that, and it's the answer. Can you give us your top 1 or 2 or 3 issues? It would be good for everybody here to really study up on, learn the history of it, learn the current events, and begin to get some traction, write some letters to representatives about.
Okay, because my first answer was going to be liberty, liberty, liberty. Okay, I have a motto: liberty over security, principle over party, truth over your favorite personality. The first thing we need to do is shift off of this party paradigm, because the real focus needs to be liberty. Both sides are getting it wrong these days. And it's very, very distressing just how wrong both sides are getting it. If you really want to know what issues we should be concentrating on, and are the issues that deal with our fundamental liberties, like the Patriot Act and National Defense Authorization Act, sections 1021, 1022. I don't know if you know this, but our Department of Justice wrote a quasi-legal document that says they have the right to secretly assassinate U.S. citizens anywhere on the planet without any due process at all. As a matter of fact, they said that their right exists because the government has an inherent right to self-defense. The government does. They don't recognize that you have an inherent right to self-defense, but they say that they have an inherent right to self-defense, and they can secretly assassinate you if they believe, now these are their words, not mine, if they believe sometime in the future you might plot against the government. They say we need no evidence to prove this because we're relying on intelligence. And the courts can't second guess us because we cannot share the intelligence with them because it's a matter of national security. So these things, the First Amendment, anything that has to do with any of our inherent rights are things that we need to be working on. I have lessons for all of these things. On my website, I pay special attention to the First, Second, and Fourth Amendments. And I have on my website one-page flyers for each of these three sets of liberties. And then I also have a little short training video that goes with the one-page flyer. Now, the one-page flyers are things that you can print out and take with you and hand out or whatever you need to do. One of the biggest challenges that we have deals with our Fourth Amendment. Because for some reason, judges and lawyers don't know how to read. And they think that it's up to the Supreme Court to tell us what words mean. And that's simply not their goal, their purpose. And the Fourth Amendment is very, very clear. It needs no further interpretation. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects from unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. Now, it doesn't end there, but we're going to pause there. You don't have the right to be free from all searches and seizures, just unreasonable ones. Now, we don't need the Supreme Court to define reasonableness, even though they do. Because the Fourth Amendment already tells us what reasonableness is. It says, no warrant shall issue, but based upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Now, in that last clause of those 5 identifying items, there's a very, very, very special legal word there. The word is and. And because that word and is in there, it means in order for there to be a reasonable search and seizure, all 5 things must be present. Not 3 out of 5, not 4 out of 5, not even 4.5 out of 5. All 5, because of that and, have to be there. So if you are having your item searched and seized without a warrant, or that warrant's not based upon probable cause, or it's not subject to due process review and challenge, or it doesn't particularly describe the place to be searched, or it doesn't particularly describe the persons or things to be seized, it is an unlawful warrant. It is actually a warrantless search, because unless all 5 things are present, then it is not a reasonable search and seizure, which means it's contrary to the Constitution, which means it's no lawful act at all. The problem is that the Supreme Court has turned that into Swiss cheese for whatever excuse they invent, because some time ago they invented a standard called compelling governmental interest. And if the government can prove it has a compelling governmental interest in something, the Supreme Court says that trumps all your rights. And so that's how the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to the Department of Justice or the NSA, because the government has a compelling governmental interest in national security. So our Supreme Court and our federal courts have turned our Fourth Amendment into Swiss cheese, and it's hardly recognizable in its enforcement. Why? Because we don't teach the Constitution in law school. And we teach because of 1803 in Marbury versus Madison. We use Marbury versus Madison to prove that judges are the supreme rulers of the universe. Yes, sir.
So recently the Idaho legislature changed it so that municipalities can change their ordinances from misdemeanor to infraction. And then there's a push to change a lot of those to infractions so that if somebody gets sideways with the law, they won't have to end up with a misdemeanor. However, if it's an infraction, then you don't get the right of representation in court.
By who?
By
Okay. Because the Sixth Amendment reads, in all criminal prosecutions, you have a right to a trial by jury of your peers. Okay? But an infraction is not criminal. However, are they going to take more than $20 from you? Then the Seventh Amendment applies, which says in all cases over $20, you have a right to a trial by jury of your peers.
but that's not going to happen.
I would argue till I was blue in the face, that's for sure. I would like to hear a court justify that with real facts on why they can take $300 from you and not give you a trial by jury of your peers, because the Seventh Amendment is very, very clear. Yes, sir.
Shouldn't that $20 figure be adjusted for inflation?
Okay, well, that's a very, very good point. Now, I am a constitutional purist, so I say no. But if you go back in time and you look at $20, now, the furthest back I could go to make that translation was 1799. And I think this is the principle that we need to take from this. If you take $20 and you apply it as 1799 terms, it comes up to be about $300. Okay? But you buy cell phones for $300 or more. You buy video games for $300 or more. All right? What we're talking about here is a principle. And it's not supposed to mean a lot of money. Now, I do not believe that we should be adjusting the Seventh Amendment to rank for inflation. Because the only way you can change the Constitution in any word or form is through a convention of an Article 5 convention or congressional alteration of the Constitution. Because if we can change $20 to mean modern day terms, why can't we change press to mean modern day terms? Or speech to be modern day terms? Yes, sir.
Well, wouldn't that $20 bill be backed by a $20 gold piece? So shouldn't you take a $20 gold piece and adjust it for that amount of money?
We're not adjusting anything. That's the point. The document has to stay as it is written, because you cannot have people adjusting terminology, because then there is absolutely no limit to their adjusting. We have congressmen. Senator Dick Durbin was on the news some time ago and said, "What is press?" He says, "We know Fox is press. We know AP is press. But are bloggers press? Are tweeters press?" He said, "We need to ask 21st century questions about a document that was written 200 years ago." And that's exactly what you're telling me. We need to ask 21st century questions about $20. But you see, the thing is, it's about a principle. Freedom of press has nothing to do with the government approving what you can and cannot say. It's exactly the opposite. And it has nothing to do with the fact that the founders didn't have the internet, because it was about the ability to speak your conscience publicly in whatever medium is available. Yes, ma'am.
You will be teaching the legislators soon. Is there any way we can require them to have continuing educational credits?
Oh, well, yeah, absolutely. You can require that if you move it together and make it a piece of legislation. I don't know, in Idaho, can you make constitutional amendments by ballot initiatives?
We have initiatives, and we have, what's the other one, Ron? Initiatives, and there's one started by the people and one...
Okay, so you can get a constitutional amendment through the people.
Yes.
Okay, so that's what you need to do. You need to do a constitutional ballot initiative to have that imposed upon your legislators. Here's the catch. Okay, think about this. You require them to have continuing education credits. Who's going to teach them?
Right.
Right. So the key then is you have to make sure they're going to be taught by the right people, because you never know, they might ask Justice Ginsburg to come and teach them about the Constitution. Okay? So these are the kind of things that we need to deal with. The real things that we should be doing is making sure that we have constitutionally valid people that we elect to office. I think part of the vetting process of every candidate should be to give them some type of examination. And if they refuse to take the test, then we have to refuse to endorse them and refuse to vote for them regardless of who wins. We get roped into this lesser of two evil things often too much. And we end up thinking that by electing the same people over and over again, we get different results. Now, you can make them go to this training session in February. You show up in numbers in their office and you say, you're going or else.